Yeah.
I see that you're all really knowledgeable about what was on at Manchester Museum. I'm just wondering, when you ask, are museums racist, do you mean Manchester Museum, or do you know what's going on in the regional museums?
Museums generally, not just Manchester, it's generic.
So, right,
Yeah.
so,
Yes.
okay.
Okay, well that can't be right actually, because there are some museums that are doing better than others. You know, and as far as I've heard, there's some museums in America which are doing better, but they're doing better because the areas they're in are areas where there are people of African ancestry. So I suppose they are doing better because they won't have anybody in there otherwise, because no Europeans are going to enter that area.
So aren't they themselves being racist in a way, in some way or other? You know,
No, that's not what I'm saying, that they're being racist. What I'm saying is that they're doing better in the sense of they're telling the story more correctly, and the people that, it just so happens that where the museum is, they have no choice but to tell that story of African people. Do you understand what I'm saying? I suppose their arms twisted because the area that the museum is in is where people of African ancestry live. So if you're saying if the museum's arms been twisted, yeah, maybe.
It's definitely
That's not what you meant though, is it?
So it's definitely a mixed bag. I mean, I know the Manchester Museum, and there are things like this going on here. There's some really positive things going on here. I know I've done work with museums in South Africa and Namibia, and there's, to an extent, what Franklin is saying is happening there, because there are things being done very well there, which I think are down to where having the opportunity to listen to people. But also there were still major problems there. There's still real issues to solve. And then I've recently had good fortune to spend a bit of time in regional museums in the northwest, and without pointing fingers at particular museums, some are much better than others in this kind of respect. So it's a really mixed bag. And
Yourself, and then I'll bring you in. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe asking the wrong question. Like history, the way history I was taught at school is like the history of the ruling class, which is white upper class males, basically. So maybe we shouldn't even be asking our museum racist, because museums are founded on the way history was taught, and that is the history of the white upper class male. Maybe we should be asking, how do we tackle the racism and the sexism and the classism in museums?
I'll give you an example of how museums are racist. Everyone knows about Hannibal, the Hannibal clip here. Okay, the British Museum in London, where I'm from, most of the portraits of Hannibal is of a white man with a pointed nose, and they have coins. Now the coins on the back of this particular portrait of Hannibal was of Indian elephants. Now we all know Hannibal's from Africa, and the coins situated in the British Museum, which you can go to, which no one knows about, is of a broad-nosed Hannibal with African elephants. Now that's a piece of information that no one's going to tell you unless you go there and ask. But a lot of the portraits we see of Hannibal is of a white male. I know most of his portraits were done in Italy at the time as well, where Hannibal didn't go to Italy. So no one really knows what he probably looked like until you go back and look at these coins. Now that's just one of the examples that we see in museums that is racist.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think, but I don't necessarily think it's. If I think about that particular picture, and in the context that it's in, yeah, it's racist. But if the museum said, this is what was produced at this time, and pointed out what discrepancies were, I think people would learn a lot more. You get what I mean? And I'm not even sure who I'm asking this stuff to. You guys have said some really interesting things over an hour. But after the hour, my question is almost, well, it's what a museum's for, really. In essence, what you're saying is that museums seem to be saying is that museums are, or British museums, are racist because they represent the history of the world incorrectly, because the pieces they hold, they're strictly of from a British perspective. But how can you accurately tell that in a museum? It's too much, isn't it? I mean, how can you? I think you mentioned District 6. I mean, I thought that was interesting. What if museums said, okay, we will tell this particular history and we'll tell it right? Maybe that might be more manageable. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I respond to that?
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I think that the idea that museums, are we going to ask museums to try and tell the entire world history in proportion to, I mean, that's obviously not feasible, and that's not what museums are about. I think that it's, I don't know if I read you wrong, that, you know, it's not saying what a museum's for, and can we actually deliver? Is it actually possible to deliver a neutral view of that? I'm not sure. But I think what I wanted to say is that it's where there are a set of values and set of ways of looking at things, and where which is a product of racism, which is why in society generally, in all the various structures, and if museums tend to reinforce that, so they fall into the same, you know, the obviously the example that we've looked at is the Egyptology collection here, for example, where lots of kids, Egypt, oh yeah, pharaohs and pyramids, you know, and then turn up to a museum and it's the same thing, and it's not having some markers to give alternative representations to create a better understanding. It's not about having, you know, I don't think it's about trying to represent everything.
Well,
does that answer your question, or
sort of? But I mean, what collections are here? I mean, I'm not. Is it just Egyptology, or are there several?
Well, in terms of Egypt, I think that's one of the most popular collections. I think that all school kids do a project, and it's about junior school kids. They do a project, and it's about the pharaohs and the pyramids and so on.
One question I can't answer is what collections are here, and I'd like to impress upon us this isn't actually a history museum. We're a museum of natural history, of living cultures, of archaeology and Egyptology. And one reason that the timeline isn't open fully is that that's one of 4 themes in a small gallery.
Yes.
And so when we're talking about writing the history of the world, this is one aspect.
But you see, when it comes to ancient Egypt, yeah, and we're talking about ancient Egypt, there's ancient Egypt and there's Kemet. Okay, so you're talking about Kemet, or ancient Egypt, that we're talking about when the Europeans have gone in there, or we're talking about the land before the invasions. So if you don't have a reference point on there, if there's no reference point on there, you're just going to see pictures, as it was just saying, oh, ancient Egyptians and pyramids again. There's no reference point to say who was there at the time.
He makes a good point, Franklin. I must agree with him entirely, because earlier on he referred to the children. It's what we're teaching our children, our youngsters. That's where it starts. And museums, of all people, as well as our schools, need to teach it accurately. As the gentleman over there says, what are they for? Now, as curators and panellists, you know what exhibition you're putting on. You know what the facts are. And if they're inaccurate, as Franklin's pointed us out so vividly there, so simply, you've only shown a portion of it, but it needs to be put into perspective, and not just a British perspective, as the gentleman over there said. So when my daughter, I mean, I have to do it as a parent, of course, but it needs to be backed up by schools and by museums, certainly, you know, by these sort of places which you can trust, which we put our trust in as parents. So it needs to be accurate. It really does. Not misrepresented, which sounds like has been going on in some museums and other institutions.
Are you responding to that very quickly? Because
what I was going to say is that I don't know about accuracy, but I think museums need to have more than one perspective, or more than 2. I think interpretation has to be much broader and more, I mean, history is contested, So you have to have many views, and you have to encourage that inquiry, so that people take all the information and create it for themselves and talk to each other, and not expect to have an answer from some kind of monolithical God who knows everything, like museums.